Hello and welcome to Topic 2 lectures. And in these lectures, we are going to be looking at the perspectives on justice. So in these lectures, we're going to be summarizing the 6 justice perspectives. In lecture 1, we're going to take a look at the crime control perspective, the rehabilitation perspective, and the due process perspective. In lecture 2, we're going to take a look at the non-interventionist perspective, the restorative justice perspective, and the equal justice perspective. Now, this week in discussion, you're going to be assigned a particular criminal justice perspective, and you're going to be asked to apply these concepts. That's what's going to take place in this week's lecture. Or in this week's discussion, sorry. And so I want to encourage you, these lectures are an overview of the different perspectives, but I want to encourage you to obviously read the textbook for a more in-depth coverage of these perspectives. So let's go ahead and get started. So there's a lot of consensus around the main goal of the criminal justice system. When you ask people, what do you think the goal of the criminal justice system should be? Most people will say the goal of the criminal justice system is social control. In other words, the goal is to maintain safety and order by preventing behavior that threatens society. So we find this consensus and agreement over that broad goal. However, we find a lot of divisions over how best to achieve this goal, okay? So for example, if the goal of the criminal justice system is to prevent behavior that is threatening, well, what is the best way to prevent that behavior, right? Is the best way to have lots of police on the streets, to have really harsh punishments in order to deter other people from engaging in that threatening behavior? Or is a good way to prevent threatening behavior to provide social investments in areas that are most likely to produce threatening behavior, and so provide education, job training in order to prevent people from turning to crime? And so there's disagreement on that. There's disagreement over which behaviors actually pose a threat. There's not disagreement over, crimes such as murder or, sexual or aggravated assault. Most people would say that poses a threat. But there are other kinds of crimes where there's disagreement about whether it is actually a threat to society. For example, prostitution, or also, selling of drugs, right? So there's disagreement over so-called, what kind of behaviors actually pose threats. And there's also disagreement about how far we want to go to maintain safety and order. It's really easy to maintain safety and order in a totalitarian society or an authoritarian society because, the people don't have any rights and the government is unlimited in what it can do in order to maintain safety and order. But we live in a constitutional democracy where the rights of the people who live here are well defined. And so, just how far are we willing to go and to trample upon the rights of people who are accused of crimes in order to maintain safety and order? And so those are just a couple of examples of some of the ways that we have divisions within how best to achieve that goal. The perspectives on justice that we're going to be learning about in these 2 lectures is going to help us understand why there are divisions over how to achieve this goal, because we're going to see that the perspectives are quite different in many ways. And I think you'll find after reading the chapter and also in combination with listening to the lectures, that just given how complex the criminal justice system is, there's really no one view that provides all of the answers. Most students don't find themselves aligned with one out of all of the 6 perspectives, but they find that the 6 perspectives provide good contributions to understanding how to achieve that goal, okay? So let's go ahead and get started taking a look at the 6 perspectives. So here is a handy chart that basically summarizes the concepts that you're going to find in the second half of chapter 1. And so there are 6 perspectives: equal justice, rehabilitation, non-intervention, restorative justice, crime control, and due process. And then it just gives you a nice little summary that you can refer to, perhaps as you're preparing for the quizzes for this chapter. All right, we're going to start with the crime control perspective, perspective one. And we start here because this is really still the dominant perspective within the United States. So we begin our discussion of the crime control perspective, starting with a quote from James Q. Wilson, who's known as sort of the father of the crime control perspective. Next week, we're going to be learning about, the trends in crimes and how crime has increased and decreased over the years, over the decades. But James Q. Wilson was writing in the 1970s when crime was really on the rise, okay? He wrote a book called Thinking About Crime, and he offers this really, provocative view about crime that most people didn't hold at this time period. And his viewpoint was basically that criminal activity is largely rational and shaped by the rewards and penalties that it offers, okay? And this is his famous quote from the book, and we'll just go ahead and read it. He says that wicked people exist. Nothing avails except to set them apart from innocent people. And many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their chances, ponder our reaction to wickedness as a clue to what they might profitably do. Now, I'd like you to pause the video right now. You can keep that up there, and I want you to sort of think about what is James Wilson trying to tell us with that? What's his thesis about crime and crime control? So take a moment to sort of look at that and try to, in your own words, explain what he's trying to say. All right, welcome back. So what did you come up with? Well, let's walk through it together. So the first thing that James Wilson says is that wicked people exist, and nothing avails except to set them apart from innocent people. And so right there, it's sort of like there are some people who are just evil at birth, right? There's nothing you can do with them. You can't rehabilitate them. You can't train them to be better people. They are just bad, and you need to set them apart from from innocent people, right? And so he says there's wicked people, evil people, and then there are fundamentally good people who would never engage in a crime for any reason. They're absolutely innocent. However, and many people, neither wicked nor innocent, that's the most of us, that's us, right? But watchful, dissembling, which means sort of dishonest, and calculating of their chances. Ponder our reaction to wickedness as a clue to what they might profitably do, okay? So basically, again, it kind of comes down to this rational calculus, right? That some people just are wicked. They're not even thinking in their right mind. Others are innocent. They would never engage in a crime. But the rest of us are just looking around and saying, okay, what happens when you commit a crime, right? What can I get out of it? If I rob somebody, am I going to get a lot of money? What's going to happen if I do it, right? Well, what's happened to other people who've done it? Have they gotten away with it? Do they not get apprehended? If they do, is it a slap on the wrist? Or are they likely to get caught and sent away for a long time, right? And so, that in sort of a nutshell is the crime control perspective. So before we go on, I just want to state something that, remember, it said that James Q. Wilson was writing in the 1970s as we see this height of the increase of crime in the United States that persists into the early 1990s. In many ways, the crime control perspective is a reaction to the rehabilitation perspective that we're going to look at next. So the rehabilitation perspective was sort of like, hey, people commit crimes, are sick, they need help, they need treatment. And James Q. Wilson is like, nah, they're not sick, they don't need help. Maybe some of them are, like the wicked. But most are rational, right? So keep that in mind. While this is the dominant viewpoint today in the United States, that really, up until the 1970s, it was the rehabilitation that was the dominant perspective. So the main focus on the crime control perspective is to prevent crime through criminal sanctions, okay? If people are rational and they are pondering what they can get away with and what happens if they commit a crime, the way you prevent crime is cracking down on crime. And so criminal sanctions such as that you're likely to get caught, criminal sanctions that, you're going to have a significant sentence, basically there's going to be a clear punishment and that people will think twice before committing a crime. Why do people commit crimes? Well, it's because they engage in a rational calculus. They ask themselves, can I get away with it? They ask themselves, what's the benefit of committing this crime? And what is the downside? What's the detriment of committing this crime? And if the benefits, if the pros outweigh the cons, you're going to commit the crime. But if the cons, if the downsides, if the detriments outweigh the benefits, then rationally you would engage in that crime. And so from this perspective, the best way to prevent crime is to make the response swift, certain, and severe. Okay. In other words, that you make sure that when people are caught, that there's swift justice. And that means sort of removing legal roadblocks, okay? Maybe removing legal roadblocks as it relates to the rights of the criminally accused, that, how many appeals are people going to get, right? How many appeals, how many trials, et cetera. They want, if you commit a crime, there's going to be there's going to be a clear connection between the crime you committed and the punishment you're going to get. They also want that punishment to be severe, okay? So swift and severe, so that you're going to get caught, that you're going to be swiftly punished, and that punishment is going to be clear, severe. So there's that close connection. And there's got to be a high level of certainty that you are actually going to get caught. Remember when we looked at, the criminal justice funnel? Only 20% of crimes are clear, right? That means if you're rational, like, the chances of me getting caught are pretty slim, so I'm going to engage in it, okay? So they want to make responses swift, certain, and severe. Removing legal roadblocks, a good example of that would be abolishing the exclusionary rule, right? The exclusionary rule, we'll learn about it more as the semester goes. Basically, it says if law enforcement collect evidence in an unlawful manner, it's inadmissible in court. It cannot be used. And so because of an error that law enforcement makes, that all the evidence that you might have that would indicate that this person is a murderer or is, a drug dealer or whatever, couldn't be used in a court of law. Okay. And so, the crime control perspective also, sort of is willing to sort of do what it takes to prevent crime, even if that means trampling on the rights of people. All right, so the next perspective that we're going to learn about is the rehabilitation perspective. So the main focus of the rehabilitation perspective is addressing the social and economic conditions that cause crime. From the crime control perspective, crime is caused by individuals engaging in rational calculus. From the rehabilitation perspective, that people are the product of their social and economic conditions. Not that they don't have some free will, clearly they do, but certain kinds of social and economic conditions cause crime, and to prevent crime, we need to basically address those situations. And they also focus on treating and caring for people who commit crimes. That's why it's rehabilitation. This perspective sees criminal offenders as somehow sick. They're either sick because they have a mental illness, they're sick because they have a drug addiction, or they're sort of like socially sick, socially ill, because they don't have like a proper education, or they're not, they don't have proper training to, get a job. And so from this perspective, those people need to be taken care of. They need to be treated, and so that they can be returned to society, or, they're in society and getting that treatment, but that way they will, not turn to crime. From the rehabilitation perspective, why do people commit crime? Well, it kind of follows from what we were just talking about with the main focus. Mental health problems, substance abuse, that an expression of frustration and anger that's created by social and economic inequality. All of these are reasons, I mean, you'll read more about it in the textbook, about why people commit crimes. So there are two main areas that the rehabilitation perspective focuses on when they're looking at, well, okay, what's the best way to prevent crime? From this, one is that they want to address the conditions that caused the crime, okay? Their thinking is either pay now or pay later, okay? In other words, that we could invest now in communities. We could invest in good public education. We can invest in making sure the education that you get actually results in the skills that you need to get a job. Invest in supporting families, a good wage, right? Paid leave. Invest now, because if you don't invest now, you're going to pay a lot later, okay? And it's going to be more, right? And so if you don't invest in education, you're going to have people who don't have skills and can't get jobs. They're going to turn to crime. If you don't invest in providing a living wage for families, again, it's going to be a disintegrated family that doesn't have the skills or the time, not the skills, but they don't have the time to transmit good values to their kids. And then the kids maybe could go out and do crime. And then if you don't invest now, then more people are going to commit crimes, and you're going to have to pay a lot more to incarcerate those folks and also to control the criminal behavior. And so one is to address the conditions that cause crime, and the other is to treat the offender, okay? That basically give offenders the tools they need to get better. That when you go to prison, you are not there just to be punished. You are there to get better. And whether that's incarceration or through probation, that you can do pretrial diversions where you say, look, you committed a crime, but get some job training, get counseling, for your mental health or your drug addiction problem, get education, right? Give people offenders the tools they need so that they don't reoffend. And that brings us to the third and last perspective that we're going to do in this part one of the lecture, which is the due process perspective, which I don't know. I like all the perspectives. I think they all have good things to contribute, but probably I am, find myself to be most closely aligned with the due process perspective, probably because I teach political science and I spend a lot of time thinking about people's constitutional rights. So let's take a look at the due process perspective. Okay. So before we can talk about the due process perspective, sort of need to define what we mean by due process. And then we also have to talk about why due process is so important for living in a constitutional democracy like the United States. So due process is the requirement that legal matters must be resolved by established rules and principles, okay? And, the reason why due process so let's give an example of due process first. When we look at those stages in the criminal justice process, right, that we just, got done doing in topic one, there's a distinct, through those steps, there are distinct procedures that are followed, right? In order to make an arrest, you have to have probable cause, right? In order to indict somebody or to charge somebody, that there's a process that's followed, either grand jury or preliminary hearing. When someone is brought to trial, there are clear legal procedures that are followed, right, during the trial, the right to remain silent, etc. And so, constitutional democracy is all about putting limits on what government can do, the power of what government can do. And that's really important in criminal justice matters. That the due process perspective is basically saying that the most important goal of the criminal justice system must be to follow the known process, the established rules and principles. Because if we don't do that, then we really cannot call ourselves a democracy. And so the main focus of the due process perspective is procedural fairness, that everybody gets treated the same way in the court, in the eyes of the law, and in the criminal justice system. Now we know that this falls short. We're going to be learning about this throughout the course of the semester. But the due process perspective basically says that there should be procedural fairness. Nobody is above the law. Nobody is below the law. People shouldn't be treated differently based on their race, their gender, their class, as they are going through the criminal justice or any legal process, but in this case, the criminal justice process. That there should be no discrimination, and that there should be a full application of civil liberties. If you have a right to an attorney, then the state provides you with an attorney. If you have the right to remain silent, then you have that right. That you don't need to talk to law enforcement as they're trying to get a confession out of you. That if you want a jury trial, then you have the right to have that. If you have a right to an appeal, you get that. We're going to do the full application of those rights. From the due process perspective, why do people commit crimes? Well, it's really not their main focus, right? They're not saying people commit crimes because of X, Y, and Z. However, what they do say is that if there's a lack of trust in democracy, if there's a lack of trust in the criminal justice system, that it doesn't follow due process, that it doesn't abide by these fair procedures, that it engages in discrimination, right? That really kind of jeopardizes the social contract. The social contract is this agreement that citizens have with their government. They agree to abide by the rules, and that the government agrees to abide by the rules. And if we both agree to abide by the rules, right, then when somebody breaks the rules, they get in trouble for it. If the citizens break the rules, they get in trouble for it. If the government breaks the rules, they get in trouble for it. And so the thinking here is that, when you don't have confidence that your government is following the rules, when you have to follow the rules, that basically leads in a lack of trust in criminal justice system. And if you don't trust the criminal justice system, that can basically be sort of mayhem, anarchy. They're not following the rules. Why do I need to follow the rules, right? And that could be a reason why people commit crimes. So why is the due process perspective so concerned with the vigorous protections of the rights of the citizens, and in this case, the rights of the criminally accused? That when the government has a lot of power to prosecute those who've committed crimes, and I think we all agree that people who commit crimes, particularly that are very harmful to society, they should be held accountable for it. However, we have to make sure that there's checks on the power of the state, because the state is mighty, the individual is weak, no matter how you slice it. When the state goes after somebody in a prosecutorial way, they have a lot of resources on their side. Not only do they have a lot of money on their side, they have a lot of experience on their side, and also they sort of have public opinion on their side. It's really, most people, maybe not most people, but it's easy to deny those who are accused of crimes their rights, because a lot of people just assume that they were guilty anyways and that they don't deserve those rights. And so due process perspective is saying, look, we got to have a necessary check on the power of the state, because in criminal matters, the state is mighty, and you have to make sure that the individual has these protections from that abuse of power. They also say that, look, sure, there might be times, because we're following the due process, not allowing evidence that's been illegally collected. Sure, there might very well be times when that those who are guilty go free. But from their perspective, it is a much greater crime to punish the innocent because their rights were taken away from them and they couldn't put up a vigorous defense than to let the criminal go free, okay? And innocent people are convicted, right? People do plead guilty to offenses that they did not commit because they're worried about the outcome in the trial, right? They might not have trust in that due process. And that finally they say they're so concerned with the vigorous protections of the rights of the accused because when due process is used, we have confidence in the outcome. If you have a fair trial, if you have competent attorneys on both sides, if the process is followed, then when the outcome is guilty or not guilty, we have confidence that that is the right decision, okay? And so that's why they are so concerned. Sorry if I got a little excited, but this is one of my favorite perspectives. Okay, that's it for part 1. And so lecture 2, we're going to take a look at the remaining 3 perspectives. Thanks for listening, and I will see you again in a moment.